What's up, guys, and welcome back to another episode of Nail That Tone, a series that's all about helping you guys achieve some of the most legendary guitar tones of all time. In this episode, we're talking about John Petrucci's As I Am guitar tone. There's a lot of cool stuff to talk about, as always, so let's get right into it. As always with the Nail That Tone series, the first thing we're talking about is finger tone. Now for this episode, there's not too much to talk about when it comes to finger tone. Obviously, John Petrucci is an amazing player, and the particular solo for this song is pretty tricky, and I may do a episode or sort of a cover on that tone itself. But since we're talking about the rhythm tone, it's pretty simple and nothing too complicated here. The only thing tricky here is trying to replicate the feedback effect that we hear in the beginning of the song. So the way I did it is I used some automation, which is not the actual proper way to do it. The actual proper way to do it would be to actually get feedback by kind of having your amplifier pretty loud and getting the guitar close to the speakers so that you can create that feedback effect. For simplicity's sake, I went for a simpler approach rather than trying to get some actual feedback, but that's probably the most tricky thing about the tone that we hear on this particular song, is trying to replicate that feedback effect that we hear in the beginning. So now we're talking about the gear that was used on this particular record. Now my research really consists of a very informative video that was published by the people over at Mesa Boogie. They have a YouTube channel where John Petrucci essentially did kind of like a clinic where he talked about the different kind of gear that he was using during the different eras of Dream Theater. And during the video, he does mention that in 2003, the Train of Thought era, he got into the Mesa Boogie Rectifier Road King series of amplifiers. So he does mention that he used that for the particular record and for the tour around this era of Dream Theater. There are some pictures of his live rig during this era that confirm this as well. And even just hearing the record, you can definitely tell that it is a rectifier based tone. He may have mixed in other amplifiers, but to me it's pretty obvious that it is a rectifier tone. So if you're looking for a good example of a good rectifier sound on a particular album, I would say check out Train of Thought by Dream Theater. For guitars during this early 2000s era, we see John Petrucci using his earlier JP models, his JP6 and JP7. So that's pretty much John Petrucci's rig, and what we hear on that album is, again, just mostly that rectifier sound mixed in with his John Petrucci signature guitar. So now we're talking about the gear that I used to get the particular sound that you guys heard in the beginning of the video. Now, since I don't currently own an actual rectifier in my collection, I decided to use my Axe-Fx3. So I'm going to go over the preset real quick. This is not really a tutorial on how to get it to sound exactly like the As I Am tone. This is just a preset that I created, so it's an overview essentially, because there's quite a bit of stuff that I do in post as well. So this is just kind of a rough sketch of kind of the tone, or how I approach the tone for this particular album, but not exactly a very refined kind of preset, if that makes sense. For amp type, I used a Recto 2 Orange Modern, and for input drive, I had it at 7.5, bass, mids. These are pretty generic settings, but one thing to keep in mind is that I added a EQ block here, and I made the amp definitely quite a bit brighter, because especially in the beginning of the song is quite a bit bright. So when those chords come in, it's pretty bright, and naturally the rectifier series of amplifiers is definitely a bit darker, so I definitely made it a bit brighter. But for the main riff, you probably want to have those frequencies a bit lower, because once the main kind of riff kind of kicks in, it's definitely a darker sound. But for the beginning, we definitely hear some pretty bright guitars. And for cab, I just use some Ownhammer IRs, which are quality stuff. And when I use Ownhammer IRs, I always like to use kind of where one side is a 57 and the other is a 421. So just to give it a little bit of variety in terms of sound. And I did add some low cut as well, because the rectifier series are pretty flubby sometimes in the lower end. So you kind of want to tighten that up, especially when you add a lot of layers of that. So that's pretty much the entire preset, nothing too special about it. Again, a lot of my presets are sometimes pretty basic, but it's like a lot of the magic kind of comes in post once I record the sounds, and then I really kind of engineer the sound to sound a lot more like the actual record. So now we're talking about what other gear you can use to get a similar sound in case you don't own a rectifier or can't currently afford one. I would certainly recommend using an American style amplifier that has high gain that's kind of in the same category as the rectifier. The PV6505 kind of comes to mind. It's very high gain and similar to a rectifier. Any other tube style American amplifier would get you pretty close to the tone in case you can't, again, afford a rectifier or looking for some kind of other options that could get you a similar tone. Anyway guys, that's pretty much it for this video. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, comment, and consider subscribing. There's a lot of cool content still to come out, so hopefully guys, we will see you in the next video.